Why, after decades in sports and recreation ministries, is Dr. Greg Linville writing a book on Christology? Today, Pastor Dan Stouffer and Dr. Greg Linville explain how the growing confusion and pluralism in our culture has led to the writing of this new book. In a world of competing voices and competing versions of Jesus, Dr. Linville sets out to equip Christians and Christian ministers with a true and biblical understanding of how to maintain the doctrine of Christ in their ministry. Now, here is our host, Pastor Dan Stouffer.
So, Dr. Linville, knowing you for as long as I've known you, which is a long time, and then CSRM has been in existence for over 3 decades, why this book now?
Yes, that's a great question, and it's not one that we thought about when we started thinking about this whole series, because Christology was just assumed that everybody was on the same page. But Dan, we found that there's a couple things that are going on that we can't assume that anymore. What can't we assume? We can't assume that everybody's on the same page about Jesus. That's sad to say, but it's the truth. And there's 2 basic areas, or maybe you could say approaches to this. The first is the external threat on Christology. And then there's the internal threat. So the external is people from outside of the church, outside of the Christian community, and we know this goes on around the world. Many of our CSRM folks have been imprisoned, shot at, killed. They've been persecuted. We think we're persecuted in America. We're recording this in America. You and I are both American. Our persecution is not nearly what some of these folks are going through. So that external threat says you can't talk about Jesus here in our country. You can't talk about Jesus in these ways. And so this book is, one purpose is designed to help those people that are in those settings to try to figure out, how can we talk about Jesus? How can we represent Jesus? And how can we do that in the sporting world? So we have a whole chapter in the book that talks about that, and we won't talk about that much here. But part of it is, how do we conceptualize Christ in this kind of a world that comes against us? In America, the external threat is real. It's not life-threatening yet, but it still comes and says, we're uncomfortable about you talking about this, talking about what? Jesus. You talk about Jesus too much. And so people in America are externally, not in the church, but outside the church, coming and saying, we don't want you talking about this. In the rest of the world, they may shoot you. In America, they're saying, we don't want you to do this. So that's the external threat. The internal threat is more why this book, I think, was even written. Because whereas maybe we get into one chapter of the book about the external, or portions of other chapters, we really get into the internal right from the jump street. And that's because denominations, whole denominations, have changed. It used to be assumed that when Christ said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by me, that was pretty exclusive. That was pretty real. But today, whole denominations are changing that and saying Christ is not the only way. He's one way. They're going to say, oh yeah, Jesus is one way. But even to the point that some are now saying it's sinful for us to even try to convert somebody to Jesus of a different religious community background, because Jesus isn't the only way. He's just one way. So there you have it in a nutshell.
And you can see why that would become a problem within the sports rec and fitness ministry area, because we're trying to reach people who are far from Christ. It usually is a non-threatening way to get people into the church and be a part of things, for sure. So, yeah, a lot of concerning issues there internally. And so I think that's a great thing for us to focus in on. And Greg, when we talk about Jesus saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me.
Him.
Yeah. Well, then, how can we not make that a priority within our churches?
That question is duh to me, but yet that's happening.
Mm.
And it's something that we have to really get to the bottom of. Do we really believe this? And that's part of what this book does. In the opening parts of it, we talk about the historical Jesus and some of the creeds. We talk about the Jesus of the whole Bible.
Mm.
And it's not just that New Testament, but it's also, he's predicted in the Old Testament, etc. And so we really are trying to help the church recognize this isn't us being arrogant, the church. It isn't us being unloving. It isn't us being condemning of other people. We're just trying to communicate what Jesus himself said. And in some ways, if you have a problem, you have a problem with Jesus.
Yeah.
If somebody has a problem with Jesus, shame on them. If they have a problem with us, shame on us. So that's why we're trying to approach this in a way of saying, we want to do this sensitively. We want to do this lovingly. We want to help local churches. The whole idea behind CSRM is to help local churches know how to empower their people to go and reach those people who are far from Jesus, those people who externally are saying you're talking too much. That may be a family member, it may be somebody at work, it may be a fellow student, it may be a neighbor. Don't talk to me too much about Jesus. So that external problem is evidenced in America, but it's also evidenced all over the world. So we're trying to help people come to this. How can we do this and help people understand that this is the most loving thing we can do?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because if we don't communicate to you that you are lost without Jesus, that eternity is not guaranteed without Jesus, without a personal faith in Jesus, this is loving. This isn't condemnatory. This isn't anything like that would make people feel, I don't know, disliked or hated, or they should be feeling loved. All right, so we do that. But in that internal, not only is it that we have to come and lovingly talk to our denominational leaders and our brothers and sisters in the Lord about how this is so important and why it's so important. But in the sports ministry world itself, there's some very good reasons why people are trying to maybe downplay Christ. Let's just take some of our brothers and sisters. They're in the paraministry world.
Yeah.
Paraministry, they're in the church.
Yeah.
They're not parachurch, so they're in the church, but they're not a local church. They're coming alongside of the church to try to reach people for Jesus. These groups all have A in their name, all right? Because they're athletic, they're athletes, they're whatever. And we're not going to name them because we're not trying to criticize them.
Sure.
But we're trying to explain some of what might be happening with them. And they're trying to go to campuses, college, university campuses, or high school campuses. They're trying to work in professional sports leagues. And all those groups are saying, nope, you can't talk about Jesus here because what do they say? We want to be tolerant of everybody.
Yeah.
And that's intolerant. Well, their very condemnatory comments about Christians is intolerant, but let's not go there for right now. And so we're trying to help those people with the A in their name who are trying to reach people who are far from Jesus. Their hearts are warm. Their hearts are good. I'm trying to reach people for Jesus. But if I go to this campus and I start using the name Jesus, I'm not allowed on there. So how can I reach that person if I'm not even allowed on the campus? I don't have access to the chapel anymore or the whatever they're doing. So when we run into folks like that, we say, we really appreciate your heart. We love your heart. But what's happening is because you're not talking about Jesus, to get on the campus, sometimes what's happening It's that internal threat. You're saying, yes, Jesus is the only way, but internally you're kind of starting to water things down. What's your thought about that? I mean, you're seeing this too.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. If we look 30 years ago when CSRM started, the church growth movement, I think it, as you said, it was assumed Jesus was at the center. But as our culture has kind of moved away from that, we have to get the church back to center of what matters most and why this book was written, why this was so important.
Well, that's our show. Thanks for joining us. We'll continue this discussion next week when we look at what happens when sports and rec ministry moves Christ from its center. If you'd like to learn more, we've placed a link to Dr. Linville's book, The Christ of Sports Ministry, the Christology of the Sports Outreach Community, in the description below. If you enjoyed this discussion, please like and subscribe. That really helps contribute to this ministry. For now, keep competing for Christ. We'll see you next time.